I was very glad earlier to listen to Thomas' presentation when he talked about how value-based campaigns are becoming increasingly problematic and should be more human-centered or people-centered campaigns. So that essentially brings me to this notion of emotions and how we can integrate emotions into strategic communications. And why should we? Well, it has this capacity to reduce conflict or transform conflict, to challenge extremist narratives, to counter disinformation that impacts communities, and influence and shape processes of social and political change. And it does so by informing, persuading, and motivate behavior, and also altering emotional outcomes. So why does emotion matter? I particularly like those two quotes. The first one is from Feldman and Hart, and they say that emotions are particularly vital to persuasive strategic communication because activating them has been shown to override identity-based concerns, lead to deeper consideration of information, and lead people to engage in personal rather than political or ideological reasoning. So when you're trying to reach out to resonate with people, it's not so much about ideology, but it's about the emotions that are driving people to connect with certain narratives, whether it's extremist propaganda or it is disinformation. Emotion is also not only to be considered as a problem. I think we have for a very long time tried to stay away from emotions because it's not rational. We don't know how to address emotions. We don't know how to integrate emotions. But as we're dealing increasingly with a world where disinformation is threatening our democracy, social cohesion, driving polarization, I think we need to understand that emotions are very important, and how can we actually integrate those emotions in the work that we do in the prevention and countering of violent extremism, and equally when we're looking at countering disinformation. So I like this notion of emotional governance that was coined by Richardson, and it's really about taking stock of collective emotions. So today I'm more here to tell you a little bit about how can we actually do it and what should we consider. So first of all, it's always good to have a situational awareness to understand what are the vulnerabilities in our communities and society, and how can, based on that, assess each risk and provide a response. So the second step when we talk about emotions is to do this emotional mapping. So what is the collective emotional status? And I'll give you an example of how it's been done in New Zealand, for example, in response to the Christchurch attacks. What is the nature of the emotions? So it's not just enough to know what are the emotions out there, but it's to know what are the nature, what is the ordering of those, because you can feel as human beings 5 to 6 different emotions at the same time. And then it becomes very confusing, overwhelming, which one of those emotions are driving your thinking. So what is the distribution of those emotions, and what is the strength of those emotions? So understanding how strong are the public emotions and what is the degree of legitimacy. We talked, for me, as an art therapist and a coach working in rehabilitation and reintegration, it's important to understand that emotions are not bad or good, they're just emotions, and they're actually telling you something about yourself. So behind the emotions, you also find the needs. This is why I think the argument of looking at how we focus on more people-centered narratives than value-centered narratives to counter some of the value-centered propaganda that we have seen with Daesh. I think one of our colleagues was mentioning this morning. It's also to integrate and not shy away from that emotional dimension. So as a coach, actually, because I wear multiple hats, we use this wheel of emotion of Plutchik. And essentially, we know that there's 8 different basic emotions, which are joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, anticipation, anger, and disgust. But with each emotion, you will have a psychological response and a behavioral response. Then Plutchik goes as far as then distinguishing a dyads, what he called a dyad. So you will have different emotions, so duo of emotions connected together that leads to a new type of emotion. So there's about 32 different emotions. And we're very poor when it comes to explaining how you feel. I feel sad. We talked about revenge. I feel joy. I feel love. I feel... So also increasing our understanding of that vocabulary is also important because it supports our understanding of those emotions, our management of those emotions. And when you can do that, you can also improve your interaction with others. So the slide that I just showed here very briefly is something that I have shared recently when I was in the Western Balkans doing some training to show how emotions connect with our body. And sometimes the way we feel emotions in our body, where we're not able to talk about it, it will actually manifest in your body. So you can see there's different types of heat. So this is based on a study that was done in Finland in 2023, and that looked at the connection between the emotions and our body. And so if I were to ask you here to try to remember the first time you fell in love, what did you feel? Where did you feel those emotions? A lot of people will talk about how they felt butterflies in their stomach. So those emotions are really real, and they drive us. So coming back to how do we do this emotional mapping? As I said, understanding the public emotions, the state of collective emotions, but those emotions are also being influenced by different types of emotional spheres of influence. So on one hand, we have the online emotional sphere of influence, which is made up of disinformation by hostile actors. So that can be extremist organizations, that can be different types of hostile actors, such as Russian disinformation, or the social media. On the other hand, we have the domestic emotional sphere of influence, which is about national politics, for instance. How much of that is also contributing to the state of collective emotions, the media, whether there's any domestic extremism discourse, and the residue of experiences. I think yesterday we talked about post-conflict and trauma. How much of that is also influencing the sphere of emotional influence of the public? So again, consider the different register of main emotions, the type of behavioral responses. And then just to give you a brief example, I will not go through her speech, but for me, to this day, I think this is the base case study or best practice that we have seen so far in terms of emotionally based strategic communication and emotional governance. And you can see here that very clearly we can use different types of emotions to shift the outcome. So here she talks about anger, sadness, compassion, trust, love, disapproval. So disapproving the use of violence, compassion, sadness, trust, hope, trust, and hope. So if you go through the actual speech that she gave following the Christchurch attacks, so the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, you can see that she has very cleverly used those different emotions to counterbalance them. The result of that is that has been a lot of compassion, not just in New Zealand, but also across the globe for what happened in Christchurch. And this includes also Muslim countries where there was very strong voices out there supporting, expressing their compassion toward what happened in New Zealand. So really integrating those emotions and not shying away from there, but it is important, but it also means that we have to develop a sophisticated understanding of those emotions, how they provoke certain responses, and how can we then integrate them in our own work. So I will finish with this in terms of principles. I hope I'm not over time, am I? Okay. So briefly, it's identify and map the public emotions, understand the quality and dynamics of those emotions, identify the emotional context, recognize and integrate those emotional experiences of men and women. Something that I did not mention is that men and women also experience emotions differently. The sense of safety and security will be different for men and women. So it's also important to integrate that into the approach. And then I will, well, you can read it up here, but I just want to finish with the last one, which is about being aware of emotional fallacy. So meaning that, yes, we use emotions, it's important to use emotions, but it's important to remember that because we're feeling certain emotions, it's not necessarily true. It still remains an emotion. So if we use an emotionally based strategic communication, it's also important that we back up those emotions with facts. And then you can actually try to reach out to the wider public. So I think I will finish here.